Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're taking a look at Kojima Productions' new Death Stranding 2 on the beach, and see how it stacks up graphically to the developer's previous entry in the series, Death Stranding, more specifically the Director's Cut version. For this comparison, both games are being played on a PlayStation 5 Pro, with the graphics settings set to prefer the highest quality. For reference, the original Death Stranding on PS5 and PS5 Pro features two graphics settings, either prioritize quality, which allows for a native 4K resolution at a target 60 frames per second, or prioritize performance mode, that uses dynamic scaling up to 4K, allowing for a more consistent 60 frames per second. Though personally, I never felt the frame rate drop much at all in the quality mode, at least when playing through it recently on PS5 Pro. Death Stranding 2 features the same two graphic settings, but the difference between them is a bit more apparent, as the quality preset will lock the game at 30 frames per second, at what I presume is a native 4K resolution, while the performance mode once again offers 60 frames per second, with a slight hit to visual quality, again likely a dynamic scaling targeting 4K or something close to it. Also, before we get started, please be sure to like this video, comment, and subscribe to the channel to catch more coverage for Death Stranding 2 and other new games coming out this summer. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first talking about the design of our character models. Now, going into this, I didn't actually anticipate much of an improvement. Death Stranding already looks incredible, with hyper-realistic model designs of real-world actors like Norman Reedus, Léa Seydoux, Guillermo del Toro, and Troy Baker, just to name a few. So, when I first booted up Death Stranding 2, I wasn't at all surprised by just how incredible every character model looked throughout the game. But what blew me away was booting up the original game afterwards, and seeing just how much of an improvement there had actually been. Norman Reedus, for example, has seen a huge increase to poly count, with details like his ears, nose, jawline, and hair all being smoothed out considerably, thanks to the higher fidelity models in the sequel. The hair cards in particular are much more impressive than before, as there was always a bit of a disconnect with some of those loose hairs on Reedus' face in the first game, that look more natural this time around. I also appreciate that his hair is now rendered loose in-game, similar to the model used inside the private rooms, which looks much more visually interesting than the ponytail he used in the original. No doubt an aesthetic choice that also avoided the need to render hair physics in the original game. Then there's the textures, that are much higher fidelity here, along with improved light interaction that gives the character a more realistic presence in most scenes. Another big upgrade are the cinematic animations that, in typical Kojima fashion, are a joy to watch, and are massively improved in the sequel as well. Facial animations help to convey subtle emotions more than most games, and are absolutely key for delivering such a complex emotional storyline. The in-game animations aren't necessarily improved as much over the original, as the same style of animation blending is at play. But that's not necessarily a bad thing either, as these were already phenomenal in the original, though other animation work like those for vehicles have been improved, which is especially important considering the changes that have been made to the environment. The environments are easily the biggest change-up this go-around, as Sam and his friends are now seeking to connect the continent of Australia, which features a much more diverse set of biomes to explore. Rocky cliffsides, rivers, vast open deserts, jungles, savannas, and an absolutely mammoth-sized mountain dominate most of the game world, and feature significantly more challenges for the player to overcome, building on the series' unique package delivery gameplay loop. The original game, on the other hand, sees players travel across what's supposed to be a post-apocalyptic United States, that, due to a supernatural entity called the Death Stranding, has turned it into something more reminiscent of Iceland. It's a very cool aesthetic and looks gorgeous in the original game, with large, rocky, moss-covered valleys lined with rivers, volcanic rock, and snow-topped peaks. Though, returning to it now, I was a little bit surprised by just how linear this game world feels in comparison. Death Stranding 2's Australia avoids this feeling by being set primarily on one gigantic landmass surrounded by water. Because of this, you're no longer limited by segmented maps like before, and despite the full map seeming fairly manageable when zoomed out like this, in reality, you can spend upwards of 30 to 40 minutes just trying to climb up one short mountain peak, and that's assuming there's no complications to contend with on the way. This map is massive, and you'd be wise to make use of vehicles far more often than you did before. As for the quality of these environments, it's safe to say the new game looks considerably better in all respects. The texture maps used on familiar surfaces like grass and rocks are all much higher resolution, and the decorative clutter like 3D rocks, plants, and other details are scaled up massively. This opening bit in the prologue, set in Mexico, was particularly impressive, with some unbelievable geometric complexity far beyond the capabilities of the original game. Add on top of that more complex environments with thick foliage, rock columns, and some incredible sand and snow simulation, and what you end up with is an environment that feels much more realistic. Lighting is another area that I feel is drastically improved here, due largely in part to the increased biome diversity that allows for more unique lighting scenarios. The original game has a somewhat drab, cold aesthetic to it, again inspired largely by the typical weather you'd expect in the northern Atlantic region like Iceland. And while that still exists within this depiction of a post-apocalyptic Australia, with areas that once more look like they're ripped straight from an Icelandic postcard, there's also these areas where you get this rich, warm tone along the desert dunes or in the dry savannas, and the beautiful, snowy mountain sequences that look substantially more realistic than those similar scenarios in the original. The standard global lighting system remains similar to that used in the original game, with a dynamic time of day coupled with what appears to be a semi-dynamic global light preset similar to what's being used with the Decima engine in the Horizon games. But the limits at which this technique is being pushed are incredible, seeing it react with things like dynamic cloud coverage, fog effects, post-processing and screen space reflections, and you get this really convincing presentation. And then you have these few sequences with the game's new secondary antagonist, Neil, that, much like the first game with Cliff, set up really interesting scenarios far removed from the standard gameplay loop, which enables the development team to really push the presentation to its limits. Especially this first segment set in a Mexican Day of the Dead celebration under siege, that features some absolutely insane visual effects that reflect off of the rainy streets. It's so convincing that I was under the impression that the developers had utilized some form of ray tracing here, but that doesn't appear to be the case, as there's a clever mix of screen space reflections and dynamic cube maps to ensure these spinning fireworks still appear in motion even when the object itself isn't visible on screen. Then you have plenty of beautiful, specular, and diffused lighting all throughout that plays exceptionally well with their dynamic rain effects. Now, there are still some downsides here, like some slight ghosting with characters in motion over top of reflective backdrops, especially in these cutscenes of Sam waking up in his private room. But otherwise, it looks much better than the original in most cases, and similar reflective surfaces like those on top of the vehicles do look to be a higher quality than those same types of reflections used before. And the shadows are also extremely impressive, with cleaned up character and object shadow rendering feeling more diffused and realistic than before, along with superior ambient occlusion to help those rocky environments really stand out. And of course, there's the effects. As mentioned previously, Death Stranding 2 features a lot of unique environmental factors to take into account, and along with them, dozens of new effects that really push the limits of the Decima engine. The particle density in particular is unreal in this game, with that same scene from the flashback sequence feeling like a huge flex from the design team for managing to pull it off. Then you have things like wildfires that will actually propagate across the savanna region, massive sandstorms, whiteouts, avalanches, flash floods, heavy rainfall, fog, earthquakes, and other more supernatural elements, and you have a real showcase of just about every effect you can think of. The original game was of course no slump in this area. Things like smoke effects still look incredible to this day, and the water simulation, especially those waterfalls, look gorgeous. And then we can't neglect to discuss those supernatural BT effects, from the ghostly particle-based visions that float in the air, to the intimidating hunter battles that fill the surrounding area with this incredible-looking dynamic tar fluid that will realistically ripple from the player, surrounding environmental objects, and the massive inky monsters themselves. But the sequel does this and more, and really pushes the limit of these effects, thanks to a higher particle density on average, improved fluid simulation and ground deformation, along with an increase to the quality of things like fire and smoke alphas. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you feel offers the best sound quality and design?
Come on, let's get this done. Brennan Barrett. Come on.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, from a pure technical perspective, Death Stranding 2 is a masterpiece, and unquestionably one of the best looking games that I've played all year. Kojima Productions sought to really deliver on the promise of a next-gen game here, and did so in a big way, taking their divisive package delivery formula and massively expanding upon it, with hyper-realistic character renders, gorgeous game environments, impressive lighting and shadowing, and a feast of visual effects. Graphically, there's no question that Death Stranding 2 is a huge step above its predecessor, and in terms of narrative, gameplay, and other overall improvements, I have quite a bit more to say, but we'll save that for my final review later this week. But for now, what do you guys think? Are you impressed with Death Stranding 2, or do you prefer the look and design of the first Death Stranding? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for my final review of Death Stranding coming this week.